And I've got 3 check marks. So that means we're live on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook.
Awesome.
And so now all the the gangs of waiting people can flood in. And I think there's a little bit of a delay before we start to see them appear in that little counter there. But good to have you with me, Cliff. I'm gonna run the introduction reel because in the first few seconds, people tend to be gathering in, and then we'll get into our conversation all about podcasting and how businesses can use this as one of the planks in their marketing strategy. And we'll start that all for everyone here in just a few minutes.
Looking forward.
I'm David C. Barnett, and you're tuned in to Small Business and Deal Making, the podcast, YouTube channel, and blog where I talk about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium-sized businesses while controlling risk. So if you're looking to take control of your future through buying a business one day, or if you already own a business and you're looking to grow or exit, you've come to the right place. I talk about interesting things, I talk to interesting people, and I answer your questions every week right here. So be sure to hit like and be sure to hit subscribe, and let's get to it.
Awesome. So first of all, thank you to whoever just hit the thumbs up. Likes do help us here on all the different social media platforms. Please, if you're tuning in, hit like. If you're watching the replay, it's also a big help. It doesn't cost anything. Just hit the like button. Today, I'm joined with guest Cliff Duvernois. Right? You see?
Yeah, you got it. Awesome.
Right.
Awesome.
And Cliff is the host of a podcast called Entrepreneurs on Podcasting. And you talk all about podcasting as a tool in the marketing or advertising mix that a business might use. And I think it's really cool because, of course, my entire business has been built upon this show and appearing on other people's shows and things like that. And that's what helped me, years ago, start to get the news out about the books I had written and then my online courses. And my schedule is filled with consulting clients who are people that find me on these different media, and they reach out to me. And so I can tell everyone what Cliff and I are going to talk about. It actually does work. It's the basis of my own business here today. Can you give us a little bit of your background in the whole world of podcasting and how you stumbled into this opportunity? Because I think you've got an interesting backstory, and it wasn't necessarily as though you went on to create, sort of a product or a service that had to do with marketing. You were trying to figure out how to make this thing work within the context of your own business at one point in the past, wasn't it?
That's correct. Yes. So thanks for having me on your show, Dave. Appreciate it. So a little bit about my backstory. It was about 2016, and I was doing real estate on the side. And at the time, I was living in LA County. So if you know anything about California, 1 out of every 6 people is a real estate agent, right? You can't throw a rock into a crowd without hitting one. So I lived in LA County, population 10 million, i.e. there's, 1.5 million people there, probably closer to 2 anyways, that are real estate agents. So my first question is how in the world am I going to differentiate myself, right? The one key question that every business owner asks themselves, we got to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. I asked my mentor, what can I possibly do? And he said, start a podcast. And I thought that guy was nuts. Now, I had listened to podcasts, like Tim Ferriss had his podcast out at the time, but I had no idea how to start a podcast, how to do a podcast. But, I was paying my mentor. So he said, well, start a podcast. So I said, okay. So I went ahead, got the podcast, got it up and running, climbed onto YouTube, which is what most people do, climbed onto YouTube. And I think I learned how to do everything wrong from those videos. And when I got done, right, and I got my podcast launched, I actually remember I sat back and I thought to myself, I wonder how many other real estate agents in LA County have a podcast. So I went out there and I looked, and there were 3 of us.
Wow.
And that was a very, very powerful lesson in the fact that podcasting can be a key differentiator in even the toughest of businesses. Like I said, if we're talking like a million, 1.5 million plus people being real estate agents, and only 3 of us got a podcast. Yeah.
Well, and this raises an interesting thing, because an interesting little topic here, because when people think of podcasting, we think World Wide Web, we think internet, we think global. And certainly one of the reasons why I made the decision to start making videos and to try to get onto the internet was because I wanted to grow my opportunities beyond the place where I live. I wanted to reach potential people all over the place that might do business with me. And what you're describing, is the fact that you weren't going to go help anyone buy or sell a house in another state or anything like that. You were
Correct.
just working in the LA area, and there's a lot of people there. It's a big market, but that locality at the time, obviously, what's that expression? All real estate is local. And so one city versus another, like the markets are always different depending on what's going on in those places. And so certainly with a population of 10 million people, there's a lot of people there who are interested in what's going on in LA real estate, who would want to tune into a very local show about that topic. And here you are. I mean, there are some countries that don't have 10 million people, and there's only a small handful of podcasts that are actually addressing that potential interest.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because one of the things that I do when I work with my clients is, let's talk about your ideal customer avatar and what it is that they're looking for. And this was a very hard thing for me to learn up front, because like you said, it's when you launch a podcast or any marketing endeavor, you always want to cast your net as wide as possible. And the problem with that is you're going to miss connecting with your ideal customer avatar. In my particular case, what I did is, because I'm local, is I actually included the name. Now, I lived in Long Beach, so I actually included the name Long Beach in the title, because I wanted to be the agent known for working in the Long Beach area, right? That's what I wanted to do. So I didn't care if somebody from Michigan or Massachusetts or France or Australia downloaded my podcast. What I was more focused on was getting people in my local community to listen to that particular podcast. So that became really the emphasis of what I focused on doing. And then from there, the next logical question is what does my ideal customer avatar care about? Well, I could get on the show and talk about real estate, but the only people who like to talk about real estate are real estate agents. Right. So I could have got on there and did an episode about, oh, well, this is how you buy a house and this is how you get a housing inspector. What I did is I took a step back and I said, you know what people really care about? And that's what's going on locally inside of the community. So then I start looking around me and I'm like, well, what are businesses that I could interview, right? What are favorite restaurants? What are favorite hotels? What are, local politicians, local businesses that maybe employ tens of thousands of people? Let me reach out to these owners, bring them onto my podcast, interview them, get their stories, and then put it back out there, because people are interested in this kind of stuff. Plus, it makes me look like I'm the local expert, right? So now when I go out and I have, like, let's say I was doing an open house at the time, somebody would come to that open house and I would say, oh, by the way, here's my podcast. At that time, I called it Long Beach Impact. And people's faces would light up. They're like, holy cow, nobody's doing a podcast. I'm like, well, I am. And so all of a sudden now I'm in their ear, right? I'm talking to them. I'm asking questions for these business owners. And here's the story behind your favorite restaurant. Here's the story behind your favorite park that you might go to, or anything else. So this really gave me a very great way to start, reminding people, obviously, that I'm in real estate, because I would mention that in the beginning of the podcast. But it also gave them additional content, because every week they're looking forward to, oh, who's the person that Cliff interviewed next.
And so, like, one of my first questions about this story is, how did you allow yourself to be discovered? How did people find you? So you mentioned that you were promoting the podcast when you would do an open house. So you'd have a bunch of people coming through to look at the property, and you'd let them know about this. Was there anything else that you did? Because I would just, titling it, with Long Beach in the name. Obviously, if I was somebody who lived in another place and I was, just realized, oh, I'm going to be moving to California, I'm going to move to LA, where might I like to move? If I started to check out the different neighborhoods and areas around LA County, I might say, well, what can I find out about Long Beach? Did you end up having subscribers or listeners that you ever heard from that were from away that found your podcast as a way to learn about that community on their sort of trajectory inward?
Yes, I did, actually. And how it would typically happen is that somebody would climb on to, like, let's say Google, and they would say, I'm interested in homes in the Long Beach area. And so they would do a search for, Long Beach, and inevitably they would find my podcast just by typing in, that, very simple term. And so what they do is they find the podcast, they listen to it, and they're like, wow, I actually like the way this guy thinks, right? And I, every now and then I would do a solo episode where I would talk about myself. I would share a story from my background, which is actually the episode that got me my first client. I mean, I produced 14 episodes before I had my first person reach out to me and say, you are the guy that we want to work with.
That's, and we'll talk about growth and audiences. We have a few comments here from some people. We got Kevin in Central Florida says, good morning. Hi, Kevin.
Morning.
How are you today? And Tactitus 1979 is joining us. Says, good morning to you, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Tactitus. Good to see you as well. So let's talk about that, because I can certainly attest that when you start something like a podcast in the very beginning, your close family friends will listen if you remind them.
Yep.
but you can.
Thanks, Mom.
It can be very frustrating in the beginning to build those numbers to get to the point where it seems like anyone is tuning in. And when some people start podcasting, they always say, I'm afraid how I'm going to sound. I say, don't worry, no one's listening in the beginning. Like, as you practice, as you develop these episodes, as you get going, you'll become better at it. And then your audience will be growing as well. From your point of view, you said it took 14 episodes to get your first client. How far did you take this in your real estate career? Like, what did it look like by the time you ended that part of your life?
So what happened was I made it to episode 22 before I hit pod fade. Now, the reason why is because I want to circle back on a couple of topics you brought up, because they're really good. First off, I mentioned before about how I went onto YouTube and I learned how to do podcasting incorrectly. Well, I really shouldn't say that. What it did is I was spending about 10 to 12 hours a week working on one podcast episode. And when you're running a business, you really don't have 12 hours to spend on an episode. I certainly did not. I mean, I had regular work that I was doing. I was doing real estate on the side, and I liked it. It would have been nice to make it a full-time career, but I just didn't have 12 hours in my day to spend working on this. But I was following the advice. And what happened was I got to a point where I was like, this model isn't sustainable. I mean, I had gotten a client, so I knew that podcasting could work, but I didn't know how to make it consistent, right? I didn't know how to pull that trigger and say, well, if I produce, another 14 episodes, I'll get another client. There was no guarantee of that. So what I did is, and it took me a few years, because what I would do is I'd pivot my business, I'd start a podcast, and then I'd go into pod fade, because I was repeating the same processes over and over.
And let's define pod fade for people out there.
Oh, my apologies. Yes. So pod fade is a phenomena where you start a podcast, and after, I think the average is 8 episodes, you stop producing episodes. So if you've ever gone to iTunes and looked for a podcast and you find one, you're like, oh, wow, this podcast is really good, and it has 8, maybe 10 episodes, and the last episode was produced like 2 years ago, then they consider that being into pod fade. And it's estimated like 60 to 80% of podcasts out there are actually in pod fade right now.
And do you think that this has to do with people's desire for sort of an instantaneous result? People think that, this is the greatest thing. Why don't I have like the Joe Rogan sized audience? Like, where are all the people? Right. And they end up being disappointed by what ultimately ends up happening in the very, very short term.
Yes. And this is one of the things that I know you and I had discussed when I had you as a guest on my podcast. It took me forever to figure that one out, because I would start a podcast and I would start producing episodes, and these podcasters would tell me that it was going to be 16, 18 months before I saw any real traction from my podcast. And I remember thinking, man, I got bills to pay today. If I'm going to be spending 10 or 12 hours on, a particular part of my marketing, I need to see a little bit of a return a little bit faster than that. Well, it wasn't until like a conversation I had probably about a year ago where the light bulb went on in my head and I realized something. All of my training was from podcasters, very successful podcasters, meaning, and when I say this, obviously the English term is, podcaster, somebody who has a podcast. But in the business sense, a podcaster is somebody who's producing a podcast, and that's how they derive their income, right? They're getting 100,000 downloads every episode. They are the Joe Rogans, right? Joe Rogan, I would consider him to be a podcaster. John Lee Dumas, Tim Ferriss, I would consider these guys all to be podcasters. What hit me was that I was an entrepreneur with a podcast. So now all of a sudden, it allowed me to free this up and sit there and say, okay, if I was an entrepreneur with a podcast, how could I reframe this now to make my podcast successful? Not in 16 months, but let's give myself 30 days. what can I do with my podcast in a span of 30 days? What are things that I can do, skills that I've learned to be able to take this podcast and really be able to turn it around? And once I did that, once I started thinking about that, some of the questions I posed to myself was, because they always say your network is your net worth. So who are the guests that I could have on my podcast that I need to have in my wheelhouse, that I could have partnerships, or maybe I could have them as a potential client? So because the podcasting, and this is Cliff's rule of podcasting number 1, podcasting is the ultimate relationship building tool.
Yeah.
It really is. You invite somebody on your podcast and you interview them, you get to spend that 30 minutes or that 1 hour asking them questions, learning about their business, learning about where they come from. And it just creates a relationship so fast, way faster than a Facebook post could or an Instagram reel could. And it's amazing how within a span of 30 days, the impact on your business is huge.
And I had forgotten to mention, but you were the June guest in my Business Buyer Adventure Group coaching program. And in that interview, we spoke for 45 minutes or an hour. I forget how long it went, but we actually used the example of a small local business. I think it was a dry cleaner as an example.
Yes.
And we said, here's the last business you could ever imagine that might be able to take advantage of a podcast. And you broke it down for the members of the group, how even that type of business could have real benefits. And it's not just to constantly, in a way, you're creating something, to use your real estate example, you're creating a media platform where your business is the sponsor of it. So, I always tell people, hey, everyone, if you want to buy a business, you need to go and sign up at businessbuyeradvantage.com. And
Boom, product
so
placement.
It's like, there's a product placement. So it's like, this channel is like an advertisement medium for my stuff. But beyond that, it's like, what other relationships could we develop? What other key people might we ever want to meet? How could someone else potentially help our business or help our business interests in some other way? And the podcast, to your point, is what opens the door to being able to cold approach people in a very warm and friendly manner, that where you're actually, sharing and giving someone a reason to spend a little bit of time with you.
So let's talk about this in a very practical sense. So I got a business, and we'll go back. We can use the dry cleaning example again, right? Because again, it's a business. It's tough business, tough margins. There's dry cleaning businesses everywhere. So let's go back to that example. I have a business, and to go back and answer your first question, I'd make a list of every strategic connection I would want to have for my business, right? Maybe it's the president of the local business convention visitors bureau, right? It could be anyone that I would want to do business with. So for instance, if I had dry cleaning, maybe I would want to go to a business that had uniforms. Like maybe there's a hotel down the street that has uniforms, and I could say, hey, I can dry clean your uniforms, whatever it is. But just make a list of all of those people that you would want to have a relationship with. Who is it that can help me with my business? It could be something, if you got a laundry business, reach out to a local restaurant that has the cloth tabletops. Reach out to the owner and say, hey, you know what? I've got this podcast. I'm interviewing local business owners on my podcast who, have an impact on our community, helping people to create memories. I would love to have you on the show and hear your story. How did you get started? And maybe give some advice to, people that are going out, maybe want to create memories for themselves. 9 times out of 10, these people are going to say yes to being interviewed. It's not every day that a media company is reaching out to them and saying, hey, I'd like to interview you. So again, it's, making up this list, reach out to these people and just say, hey, I'd love to interview you on your podcast. And as you're doing that, you're building a relationship with them before and after the podcast is done, where you're just making that relationship that much deeper. And then of course, what they'll do is, like, let's say, for instance, I reached out to a restaurant to have them on my channel. They're going to broadcast it out on their socials, right? Hey, our owner of our business was interviewed on the blah, blah, blah local podcast, right? Whatever, Whoville, right? We'll make our fictional town Whoville, the Whoville podcast, right? They're been featured on there. All of a sudden you got introduced to their followers, right? Their audience.
It's
And
the
they're like,
leveraging of different social media audiences.
there you go. You're leveraging somebody else's audience to get your message out. And they're going to come listen to your podcast and they will say, wow, this is actually a pretty cool podcast. And look at, there's this other restaurant that we like. And oh, look, there's the food truck that we like. And then here's this. And then, you know, what's going to happen? People are going to start binging your episodes. And now if you release one episode a week doing that, getting exposed to all of these different audiences that are out there, number one, it's going to grow your audience tremendously. And number two, like you did with that really slick product placement down there at the bottom, it gives you a prime opportunity to say, you know, as a dry cleaner, you're like, hey, you know what, this week we're having a 2-for-1 sale. If you want to come in, drop off your dry cleaning, you know, 10% off. Just mention this podcast when you come in through the door. There's any number of ways that you could come in there with your podcast and, you know, let people know that you're in business, support your local business. Right? We're local. We're in your community. We're right down the road. You're probably, you know, half the people listening to that would probably say, man, I didn't even know there was a dry cleaner there. Well, you just helped to spread the word and the cost for that was zero.
Well, hey, Cliff, I got a question here that comes in from David Kittle. And he says, hi, David, started a podcast to get in more healthcare business owners, interviewing advisors, brokers, etc. So this is someone who's out there in the market trying to buy businesses. They're buying physical therapy practices in New York and New Jersey. What's a good way to have someone on for an interview? Find a mutual connection or a warm intro? Have you found that that's important?
No.
Okay.
No. The thing is, obviously, if it's a warm intro, the odds of them saying yes are going to be a lot more. But don't let that slow you down, right? Make your list of people, whether it's warm or cold, reach out to them, you know, connect with them like on LinkedIn or on Facebook. Go to their website, find their email address. And when you reach out to them in the subject line, just put podcast interview request. Guarantee you they're going to open that email. Guarantee you.
Do you think that people who are just starting off, who have a low number of, say, subscribers or followers or downloads, are at a disadvantage when it comes to inviting people to come on as guests?
Ooh, great question. And the answer to that is no. And I will say that because I know somebody out there right now is shaking their head like, well, what if, you know, how do I tell these people I got to? No, you know what matters is peers. So what I would do is if I was just starting on a brand new, you know, podcast networking, is I would sit there and ask anybody in my wheelhouse, right? Who do I know? Who's like, you know, a friend of mine that I could have on the podcast? Once you've interviewed them, when you send out that first email introduction and say, hey, we've got a podcast, we're talking to local business owners in this vertical niche, we've had people ask questions, oh, by the way, we have interviewed this person, and this person. I'm trying to get my fingers in there, right? So you actually list them in there, right? And if you've released your podcast episodes already, include a link that they can listen to. Once they see their peers on that list, the odds of them saying yes are going to go through the roof. They won't even care about their downloads. What they're going to care about is that, you know, first off, you're serious, right? You've got your podcast and you're out there. But second off, you're actually out there interviewing people that, you know, they would consider, like I said, their peers. So whenever I send out any kind of a cold email, I always make sure to include at least 3 links to people who are in a similar vertical to them, maybe even their competitors, and say, I got a podcast. This is what I'm doing. Oh, by the way, here's 3 people that I interviewed, right? And then that will increase the chances even more of them saying yes. So, but I do want to share this with you because that was actually a really great question. And I just want to manage expectations. So you can expect that out of the 20 invites that you send for your podcast, probably 10 of them will open the email. We got to be real. The other 10 is probably going to go in their spam folder, promotion folder, and they'll never see it. But 10 of them will get the email. 6 or 7 of them will actually open it. And maybe about 3 will actually book the interview. Right.
So there's a certain law of numbers there.
Yes.
And this whole idea of how popular is the show, how popular is the platform, this again goes back to the topic of podcasters versus business owners who podcast. Because I can tell you guys, like I sometimes get invited on a podcast that's just new and it has relatively few downloads. And people will very meekly say, hey, Dave, would you like to come on my podcast? And I often will say yes, if their topicality frames within the stuff that I talk about, right? And I've gone on podcasts that are very new with very few number of downloads. And then I'll get somebody who sends me an email and they'll say, I learned about you on that little podcast and I started listening to your show and I became a subscriber. And then they end up signing up for something that I do, or they become a customer of mine. And so I always frame it back to this. If you were ever invited to come and speak at some kind of meeting, like a Rotary Club luncheon that had 30 people, and you were going to be given the floor for 15 minutes to speak in front of those people, would you go to talk about your business? And almost every business person would say yes. But for some reason, when people think about podcasts, they're like, well, they only get 100 downloads. It's literally the size of the audience now is 100. It's even better than that Rotary Club luncheon example. But for some reason, people frame it differently in their mind.
Can I one-up you there?
Yeah, sure.
So let's do that. So we talked about how if you had 15 minutes at a Rotary Club to talk to people, you would definitely take that opportunity. But guess what? That's a one-time thing. You record a podcast episode with somebody, it is out there forever. And that's the beautiful thing about having a podcast. So I have you on my podcast, right? We did a great interview, loved your story, published it out there. Now I have released probably about 15 more episodes after you. This is 15 new audiences that my podcast has now gotten exposed to. Now, out of those 15 audiences, people find the podcast, they listen to the interview, and they say, I like it. And they look down and they see Dave. They see buying and selling businesses. And they're like, oh, what's this? Boom. And they hit it. So what happens is that people will binge podcasts. And I'm sure that people on your show right now that listen to podcasts, they found a podcast, liked it, and binged it. Now, if you can imagine.
I have.
Yeah, I have. Definitely I have. And so now you think about that in terms of your podcast episodes, right? And this is something that I tell my clients. Think about every episode as a little salesperson for your business. Right? Every single one of them. That's why you make sure you got your product placement in there, right? But they work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, you get your podcast, you put on an episode, it's a 30-minute episode, right? What can you possibly do in 30 minutes? Somebody binges 10, 20, 50 episodes, and they're hearing your message again and again and again. If you're interested in buying, selling a business, and it's going to get into their head and they're going to hear you. And by the time that they're like, you know what, I'm interested in buying a business, Dave is the guy that I want to talk to. I feel like I already know him. I've listened to all of his podcast episodes. I know his voice. I know how he thinks. Go all in.
Yeah, it's and everything that Cliff is saying, guys, is true. I mean, the statistics of my own YouTube channel, and what I do is I have an audio feed for the podcast services. It's just the audio from this YouTube channel that gets put over there. Some people like to listen to it in the audio format when they're driving and whatnot. But I see the back end statistics and data, and there are videos that I made years and years ago that continue to get new views every week, and it's because somebody typed something into Google or something, and they're looking for some piece of information. And for whatever reason, the search engine says, you know what, this content is applicable to your question. And it gives me a good search result. And then that, like you said, everyone's a salesman. I use the analogy of, it's almost like leaving breadcrumbs or a fisherman that has hooks in the sea. Like these are all different opportunities for people to bump into you. And the longer you go, the more of them there are. And the easier it is for people to find you overall.
Yes. And so, to kind of go back to a little bit what we were talking about before, if I reach out to a guest, somebody I'd like to have on my podcast, and they come back to me and they say, yeah, I'm interested in being on your show. How many downloads you get? I don't invite them on the show. What I'm interested in is having somebody come onto my podcast who wants to share their message with my audience. And my audience is growing. So the people that I want to have on my podcast understand the compounding effect, right? If I, some people might draw the line and say, well, I won't come on your show unless you have 1 million people. Well, thanks for wasting my time. I don't care about having 1 million people. What you've demonstrated, Dave, with your show, I'm going to use you an example. And this was really impressive. And I have used your statistics more times than I can shake a stick at. Your podcast doesn't get 1 million downloads, doesn't get 100,000 downloads, right? You don't have 100,000 subscribers on YouTube.
Nope.
But what's interesting is with the small number of subscribers that you have, the small number of downloads that you're getting, and what you said on my podcast, you are busier than ever.
Yeah.
So
Oh, you don't need a big audience. You just need the
the
right
right
audience.
audience. Yes.
And that's again the difference between a business owner who uses podcasting to market versus a podcaster.
There you go.
My kids will watch these people on YouTube that are like playing video games or teaching like makeup application and stuff like this, and that's all they do is they create that content, and they're relying upon the advertisers and everything that YouTube has in order to create monetization for them. So that is a true media business. It's like your local radio station putting ads
Yes.
in to earn money, to have a going concern as a business. And when you're a business owner that podcasts, you've already got a different monetization mechanism built. My monetization is the books, the online courses, the consulting work. So what it is I'm trying, like if you started a brand new podcast to try to be like Joe Rogan, how big would you have to get before you got your first sponsorship, right? I mean, it would be a huge amount of work. When you're
Yeah.
a business owner who does podcasting, that sponsorship question is already dealt with because it's you. You're using this to promote yourself. And in talking about sponsorship, I have to read a sponsorship message, but when we get back, I'm going to ask you about evergreen versus new timely content in just
Beautiful.
1 second. So this episode of the David C. Barnett Small Business and Deal Making live stream is brought to you by smbpodcastnetwork.com. The network is a collection of podcasts and shows from around the internet which focus on bringing you interviews with amazing guests who share actionable advice, ideas, and information for small and medium-sized business owners and entrepreneurs. If you go and visit smbpodcastnetwork.com, you can learn more and subscribe to their email list, which will provide you with a weekly rundown of all the latest episodes that have been released from members of the network. Speaking of podcasts.
Boom.
So you talked about the example of the dry cleaner saying this week we have a special. And then we talked about how the lifespan of a podcast episode is timeless. It's there forever. So let me ask you, what is your experience and what is your feedback and opinion about the sort of news angle versus the evergreen angle? Because a lot of times when I make a podcast recording, I'm answering, like I'll think to myself, this is going to be there forever. And I may choose not to talk about like a recent event sort of thing that might date the video. And then at other times, I might do something like a live stream where I may be more open to discussing current events, like we did during the whole C-19 thing that was going on. Obviously that was big news for small business when I was talking about that a bit more. What's your opinion on the sort of give and take between those two focuses?
Sure thing. First off, if you think your audience would find it of value, then tell that story.
Okay.
The reason why I say that is because you're right. If somebody came to my podcast and listened to it and there was an episode where I was talking about how Ronald Reagan won re-election, they're like, whoa, this episode's really old. But you know what? Part of creating your podcast is also documenting your journey. So here's an example. Yesterday, I had an awesome interview with an investment banker. He has a podcast that's out there and he's using it. He only gets about 150 downloads per episode, but those 150 downloads are his current customers. So when the market, goes down, when it tanks, when, inflation starts, going up and everything else like that, the first thing he does is he creates an episode to talk to his audience about what's going on and how it's going to impact them. Right. And how you don't want to make emotional decisions.
He's basically having a huddle with his customers.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, 10 years from now.
But it's public.
Yeah, it's public. Now,
Okay.
10 years from now, somebody's going to find his podcast because he's doing really well and he's going to keep doing it. But 10 years from now, somebody will find that episode. They will listen to it and be like, wow, that was way back in 2022. But you know what's more important? More important is the fact that he took the time to talk to his audience. It shows that he cares about them. It shows that he wants to educate them about what is happening in that current market. And it's a documenting. Like if somebody sit there and say, wow, he took care of his clients back in 2022. 8 years later, we had another recession in 2030. So I know that if I work with this guy, he's actually going to be level with me. He's actually going to tell me what the skinny is, what the scoop is. So even though that content might be out of date, it does show your back catalog. It does show your character. and how you treat your business, what your philosophy is. So that's with regards to the current content. Evergreen content, I love, because you know what? In my opinion, there really is no such thing as evergreen content, because all of us are evolving. The internet is moving at breakneck speeds. So even now, today, I've got a framework that I use to get my clients results. I know that my framework works, but guess what? Somebody could come out with a piece of technology tomorrow that just takes half my framework and makes it obsolete. And I'm okay with that, because I will go back and I will update I won't go back and change previous episodes, but what I'll start doing is producing new content that says, you know what, in my old framework, we talked about this. Well, now they've come out with this new piece of software that now eliminates 2 hours worth of work from your editing process. Let's talk about how that impacts the framework, how that's going to impact you. So in a way, it's kind of evergreen, but just keep in mind the fact, like I said, everything is changing at breakneck speeds. So, everything could be, it could be one way one day, and then the next day, it could change. Someone could pass a law or a piece of legislation that impacts how you buy or sell a business, which could impact your framework that you use to get your clients results.
It's true, totally true. We got another follow-up comment here from Dave Kittle. This is getting new podcast guests from LinkedIn has worked better than cold email. I think it's because they can see our mutual LinkedIn connections and view my recent posts, which they can't see via cold email. I think this is, this is actually something I do. So when sometimes we'll have a team huddle over here and we'll think about who we might want to have on the show. And one of the things that Erica will do is she'll find what their social media is, and their LinkedIn and their Twitter and Instagram, and how many followers they have and what they're doing, if they're active, if they're not, and so I'll go take a look at that stuff and kind of check out what they're doing, maybe listen to a podcast that person's been on, and then my go-to outreach is through LinkedIn as well, just for that very reason that Dave just said. If I find the person and see that we've got sometimes I'll find someone to see that we've got hundreds of mutual connections, and it's like, whoa, well, I probably should know this person already anyway. So it's very obvious when they see that, when that invitation's coming in, that there's a lot of common connectivity there.
Yeah. So let's kind of dissect what Dave's message there was about reaching out onto LinkedIn. So in addition to having your ideal customer avatar, it's always good to have an ideal guest avatar. And so, like for David's case, for instance, they're very active on LinkedIn, right? They're using LinkedIn. They're checking their LinkedIn messages, right? They're posting on LinkedIn, very active on there. I've got another podcast that I do on the side that's more local to the state of Michigan. My guests are not active on LinkedIn at all. So what I found is that email is my first go-to. And then if I don't hear anything from the potential guests via email or on the email, I will go find them on Facebook. Because 9 times out of 10, I know that they're active on Facebook. So understanding the platforms that your ideal customer avatar is using, as well as your ideal guest avatar is using, will definitely set you up for success. So in David's case, like I said, he knows that they're very active on LinkedIn. So I reach out to him on LinkedIn. Boom, I am getting a response. Another nice thing with using LinkedIn, though, and I have to admit this, you get past the gatekeepers.
You can, because you're not supposed to have other people using your LinkedIn account. It's supposed to be just the person. Don Luis Guerrera says, excellent podcast. Thank you, Don Luis, for tuning in. Please smash the thumbs up button. We like it when people like us. So speaking about that, it's interesting. Like I've had friends before where I've talked about being online and stuff. And to your point about LinkedIn, I've actually had someone say to me, LinkedIn, isn't that for finding a job? And they literally haven't logged in since they went looking for their last job. And I'll say, you should log in right now. And they'll open it up and it'll say that they have like 2,200 connection requests or something like that.
Yes.
And it's all these people have been pushing them a connection request and they've just been ignoring it all. So, I mean, this is a message to people listening in the audience. If you're in business or involved in business, you should not ignore LinkedIn because yes, there are some people on there trying to sell you something. And yes, there's some spammy stuff that happens there. But I mean, it's open as a tab all day long on my desktop because it's just this great resource just for discovering and finding and researching what someone's doing or what someone's about.
Yeah, definitely. And for, LinkedIn, what we found is we actually get a lot more engagement on LinkedIn than I thought. I would thought we would get a lot more on Facebook. But what I realized is that because, my podcast, our ideal guest avatar is an entrepreneur, a business owner. There's a lot of business owners that are on LinkedIn. So what we've seen is from our marketing purposes and reaching out to people, that LinkedIn has become a really nice, viable platform for us to be able to, further connect with guests, have them on the podcast, really do what we can to bolster what it is that we are doing. If they put out a good post and, I've got something to say, I'll always repost it to my account, and it gets a lot more eyeballs on their content, as well as, exposing me more to their audience, which is in turn helping me grow my audience on my podcast. So it's a very viable platform. If you can, the one thing I will say is, this is something that I learned from a LinkedIn expert. LinkedIn does not work like Facebook, so don't treat it like Facebook. Right? When you're on LinkedIn, always make sure that you're thinking again in terms of strategic connections, right? So I made the mistake of accepting anybody's request when I first got on there, and I got like 3,500 people. And guess what? None of them were my ideal customer avatar, like at all. I would post a piece of content and nobody would like it. Well, like my friend Charles, he would like it, but he likes everything I put out there. So, with that being said, be strategic when you're looking at your connections, and just ask yourself, who would I want to connect with? Who do I want to see my content, right? Ideally, your ideal customer avatar, go find them and send them a connection request. And then you know what you do after you send them a connection request? Invite them to be on your podcast. And then when you got them on that podcast, you got that relationship building with them, you're just moving them through your sales funnel.
Let's talk about platforms. I know we have been touching about this the whole time.
Yes.
But when we say podcast, a lot of people will think like audio podcasts, like from Apple Podcasts or Google has
Spotify
platforms, Spotify, all these kinds of things. And really what we're talking about is long form content, could be audio or video and audio, and really how you distribute it. Like in my normal course of business, I put something on YouTube. I take the audio, I put that onto the podcast feeder that I use that populates all those services we just mentioned. But then I'll also take that and put it onto LinkedIn, and I'll take that and I'll put it onto Facebook and share about it on Twitter and stuff like this, just to try to introduce anyone who might be connected to me on any of these things to be able to access that content. What would you say about like sort of a strategy to make sure that you are reusing this content in a lot of different ways? Like, are there any sort of key highlights people can take away about thinking about these different platforms?
Definitely. What I would recommend that you do is, this was something that I really struggled with for a long time. And then one day it just hit me like a ton of lead. It's like, why am I making this so hard on myself? So, at the beginning of the week, I sit down with my team. And before, what I would do is I'd say, okay, so let's put this on Facebook. Let's put this on LinkedIn. Let me come up with a reel for Instagram. Oh, we've got a podcast episode. And should we do a video and post it out on YouTube? Just put all that away. Forget about it. If anything, think of your podcast as the tip of your marketing spear. You go out and you create an episode, or you interview a guest on your specific episode. That right there should give you more than the content to cover all platforms through the week for the next 2 weeks. And then you could always rebroadcast that same podcast episode 3 months from now, right? Here's a flashback, right? Remember back to episode 15 when I had David Barnett on my podcast. Now, from the podcast episode, what could you do with that? Well, first off, you could always break it up into really small audio snippets. They're called audiograms, and post them out on all the different social platforms. They last about 30 seconds. Somebody's going to be scrolling through their feed on Facebook, and all of a sudden they see a video and it's got little words at the bottom. They're like, oh, I'll stop and listen to this. Another thing you can do is create quote cards, right? Quote cards are great. I use quote cards a lot because this
is something we've just started actually over here.
Yes.
We create these quote cards that go onto like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where it's a couple lines of something that was said during one of my episodes.
Yes, correct. A great call. Great call. Another thing you do is you take your podcast episode, get it transcribed, send it to somebody on Fiverr, and for $5 or $10, say, you know what? I need an article. This is what I want you to cover, like the 3 ways to do this or a story about this, whatever it is, and have them take your 30-minute transcript, boil it down into a 400, 500 word article. And if you're an SEO guy, you can do that. But boil it down to like a 400 word article, 500 word article. And now you've got something to post to your website as a blog article, put it onto Medium. You could post it to LinkedIn as an article there. So remember, all of this came from one podcast episode, one 30-minute episode that you did, and you're now able to string out all of this great content from that one particular episode. So don't spend your time racking your brain trying to figure out what can I post here, what can I post here. Look at your podcast episode. You'd be like, you know what? David said something really cool about not being based on how many downloads, but having the right audience. Let's use that quote. Right. And then all of a sudden you've covered Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. That one quote card that you built just did that. So that's that kind of stuff there. Repurposing content is awesome as far as like getting your message out there. People are hearing things. Plus it gives you the option to tag the person, especially if you're doing a quote card for.
Yeah.
So once again, you got in front of their audience when they did the podcast and said, hey, here, I've been on this podcast, but now you're tagging them again with a quote card. Right? Tagging them this week. You might tag them again next week. If you found another great quote, you might tag them 3 months from now. So now you're getting in front of their audience multiple times. So, and that's just remember, just, when you're creating this content, tag the people in there. One of the things that I like to do for my podcast, and I know that you've seen this, Dave, is every 5th episode is a solo episode where I talk about a particular topic, and I find threads throughout my previous interviews that I've done. And what I do is I pull the quotes right from the quote cards, and I actually stick it in the audio portion of my new podcast. So now I get exposed to their audience again by saying, hey, today's episode, I talk about the power of consistency in building a relationship. And then I reference the 2 or 3 people that I got on the podcast. I found a great quote from Simon Sinek, stitched it all together in an episode, pushed it out there. And those episodes typically are my most downloaded episodes. And it's just because, like I was telling you before, I just take a quick quote from you, take a quick quote from, Rachel Cook or from James Schmack, and put it out there. So there's any number of ways that you can repurpose this content, create more episodes, create more quote cards, create more articles, which, it's a great tool for that all the way around. It removes a lot of unnecessary stress, so to speak, coming up with new content all the time.
That's awesome. We have a comment here from Paul. He says, thanks, David and Cliff. Great insights to help encourage us to be fully engaged in our business pursuits 2022 style.
Yes.
Very relevant and current suggestions. Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for tuning in. Cliff, if people tune into the Entrepreneurs on Podcasting podcast, what kind of content are they going to hear over there?
So what they're going to hear, so the whole reason why I started Entrepreneurs on Podcasting was because before you and I were talking about pod fade, and entrepreneurs, 60-80% of podcasts go into pod fade. They give up, they're burning out. What I wanted to do is I wanted to create a show that could showcase how entrepreneurs with a podcast are crushing it, right? Not so much podcasters. Now, I've had a couple podcasters on the show. It's been great to get their perspective, but most of them, David, are just like you. They've got a real business. They've got payroll to make, right? They're not, making money based on the number of downloads that they get. They're making money because they're selling courses or they're selling, their services, consulting services, whatever that might be. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling these entrepreneurs who have these podcasts onto the show and just asking them, how did you do it? How do you structure your business? How do you make your offers? How do you drive people to your offers? What kind of offers are you making? What did you find that worked? What did you find that didn't work? In every single episode, every interview I've done so far, the guest has always revealed 1 or 2 things. And I thought I was really good at this, but I'm learning new things all of the time. So for every single episode that walks out the door, you'll find a lot of consistencies between them, right? But in between all the episodes. But there's always that 1 or 2 nuggets that comes out in the episode that I'm just like, oh my goodness, that is so slick how they're doing that.
That's awesome. And I'm looking forward to tuning in to listen to some more of your show. How can people find you online? Let's let everyone know how they can find you, and so we can all get back to work. I know people don't work Friday afternoon, but
Yes, definitely. So the best way to find me is I will not make you spell my last name, Duvernois, because that's going to take way too long. But if you go to any one of the podcast platforms that are out there and you just type in Entrepreneurs on Podcasting, you'll find me. If you go to entrepreneursonpodcasting.com, you'll find a show on there. Listen to the episodes, engage with the content, learn something from it about how podcasting can really help your really help your business. Because one of the things that I've discovered is 9 times out of 10, it boils down to mindset. And every single episode, every entrepreneur that has come on there and talked about their podcast has talked about the importance of having the right mindset when going in. It's not just, oh, well, let's just create a podcast and we'll get 1 million downloads. That's not it. Every single one of them started and said, you know what, I've got a goal. I've got a product. I want to start drawing attention to the product or service that I'm offering. Do it from there. So entrepreneursonpodcasting.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us today, Cliff. It was a great interview. This builds upon the interview you and I did before for the Business Buyer Adventure Group Coaching Program. If any of you out there are interested in learning more about that program, just head over to businessbuyeradventure.com. It's the group coaching program that I run. And if you're big into social media, hit me up on Twitter at @dbarnettmoncton. I'm going to hit the exit reel right now, and we're going to sign off. And I'm going to wish you and everyone else to have a great weekend.
Thanks again, Dave.
All right. Bye-bye. So how can you learn more about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium-sized businesses? Easy. Head over to my blog site, davidcbarnett.com, where you can learn more about me and how I work with my clients. You can learn more about my books and the online courses that I've prepared for you. You can find out about how to subscribe to my email list, the YouTube playlists, etc. There's literally hundreds of hours of content there, all for free, and I'd love for you to be my guest. Special thanks go out to Jeff Alpaugh Customs for being my tailor. Men all around the world can look dangerous, just like me, with the help of Jeff Alpaugh Customs. JeffAlpaugh.com. Use the code DCB10 to save. They handle multiple currencies and ship anywhere you happen to be.